This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired. Which one? Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 11 edition of the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. As always, I am your host, guiding you through this fantasy football season, Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King. That's J-A-R-V as in Victor, I the King. Hit me up on Twitter. Give me all your fantasy questions, and I will try and help you out as best as I can. And I'm here today. It's Friday, November 18th. I am 9th in my Slackjaw League. I sit at 3-7, but I'm telling you, I still have hope. And I think a lot of you, there's still hope for a lot of you out there, especially in leagues where there's six, especially if it's a larger league and there's a lot of spots, at least 6 spots. Because in a lot of just looking at my league right now, I'm at 3-7 and I am in 9th place. So you would say that's probably one of the worst positions possible. But anything can happen in fantasy football. If we've seen, I had the discussion with the doc a couple weeks ago that is it luck? Is it skill? And regardless of how you fall on it, there is a very big combination of both. And the way that the end of the season shapes up here in my league, it's completely possible that I could make it up into the playoffs. So I saw 3-7, the scenario, hey, if I win out, I could possibly make it in the playoffs. And I was thinking in my head, well, maybe the other teams have a favorable schedule, so somebody could get a win here. But I went and looked at our schedule, and it actually works out in my favor. I play some of the teams that are ahead of me, so if I take care of my own business, I'll be set. And then a lot of the teams who are already pretty stacked in the playoffs, they have the better ranking. They're 8-2, 7-3. They play all those teams right in front of me. So there is still a fighting chance to make it into the playoffs. So that is what brings me hope onto this podcast, and I'm going to try to help you all get into your fantasy playoffs. It's week 11. You got 3 more weeks to make as big of waves as possible. And let's dive right into these matchups. And I'm going to start out with my favorite team, the Detroit Lions at home taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Jaguars, they were definitely looked at to be a better team this year. And I think anybody who drafted Blake Bortles to be their number 1 quarterback has definitely been burned. But if there's ever a week where Blake Bortles is going to go off, it is going to be against the Detroit Lions, because the Detroit Lions defense is pretty soft. Now the Lions are 5-4, but they give up a ton of yards to offenses. So Blake Bortles might have a good game if he can get things going. So I think he's right on the edge of the top 10 for fantasy quarterbacks this week. I'm not a huge fan of either of the running backs between TJ Yeldon and Chris Ivory, because it just seems to go back and forth week in, week out, that one guy does good, the other guy does good, and more than likely they really aren't doing too much for your fantasy roster. So TJ Yeldon, I think, really only in PPR leagues that I have value for him. And Chris Ivory, I would only really start him in case of an emergency. I think he's a better guy just to have on your bench. So like I said, with Blake Bortles having a good game, I think that spells success for the wide receivers. I think the number 1 guy, Allen Robinson, is probably going to be matched up against the Lions' top corners. But Allen Robinson is a very talented wide receiver, so he should still be able to get open. I think Allen Hurns, he comes into the flex conversation in this week because of the possibilities going up against the Lions, and probably the one guy outside of Blake Bortles who could have some of the best matchups of the week is their tight end Julius Thomas. The Lions have continually struggled covering any tight end this year. So I think Julius Thomas being a really skilled tight end, we saw what Delanie Walker did earlier in the season against the Lions. I think he could do the exact same thing, and Julius Thomas could have a big day. On the other side, you got my team, the Detroit Lions, Matthew Stafford. The Jaguars are 2-8 or 3-7 for a reason. So the Lions are going to, as much as the Jaguars are going to be able to put up points, the Lions are going to be able to put up points too because they have a pretty solid offense. Matthew Stafford should have a good day against this defense. At running back, I think Theo Riddick really is the main guy you want to go with. I'd feel better with him in PPR leagues because you're getting those extra points on the pass catches. But I'm not a huge, Dwayne Washington hasn't done enough yet fantasy-wise to really merit him starting as a running back or even as a flex. So I wouldn't worry about Dwayne Washington. The wide receivers, Golden Tate he's become the number one guy. I've talked about it on the other podcast, the Motor City Sports Rant, that it's really switched from the beginning of the season where they were trying to push the ball to Marvin Jones. And Golden Tate he's been the most targeted wide receiver on the team after that 1-4 beginning of their season. So Golden Tate will continue to be the focal point of the wide receivers. I think Marvin Jones he's still going to get some targets this week, and maybe he can do some better things because he's definitely fallen off a little bit. And then Eric Ebron has actually been getting a ton of targets. And, outside of Golden Tate, I think it's Tate, Riddick, and Ebron have been the main factors in this offense the last couple of weeks. So I think Ebron, after coming off the bye week, he's healthier. So I think Ebron he's a sneaky tight end play this week. Going on to the next game, you got the Pittsburgh Steelers going to the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns still have not won a game yet. I know the Lions are hoping that they break that streak so they can have 0-16 all to themselves. But that's a whole nother discussion in itself. So the Pittsburgh Steelers, they should have a field day against the Browns because everyone has. So I really like everyone on this team. I like Big Ben to have a pretty solid game. I like Le'Veon Bell. I think Antonio Brown should have another ginormous game. And then you go to the other wide receivers. I think Eli Rogers is really the number 2 guy now. And then Sammy Coates is really just a flyer. And I'd probably just leave him on your bench really until you never know if there's going to be an injury. And then Sammy Coates becomes relevant again. The one detractor that I would put on the Steelers is that it's kind of a rivalry game. The Steelers and Browns usually always play hard. But I think the Steelers it's just not the Browns' year, so the Steelers are going to just destroy them. The Browns quarterback situation, you're not going to start any of those guys. And whether it's Cody Kessler, RG3 may actually come back and play this game, but he's probably not going to, and it's not going to matter fantasy-wise. So don't play any Cleveland quarterback. The running backs, Duke Johnson, Isaiah Crowell. Duke Johnson's every now and then. I think he's really only in PPR. It's his only value. And Isaiah Crowell, maybe I can't get behind Isaiah Crowell. Even when he did good in the year, it's the Browns. The Browns as a whole are just kind of toxic. The only guy I like, and I'll still say it, is Terrell Pryor, because he's really the only wide receiver on this team right now who's going to do anything. So I think if you're going to start anybody on the Browns, I go with Terrell Pryor. Next matchup you got AFC South matchup with the Tennessee Titans taking on the Indianapolis Colts. And these teams actually have something in common right now, aside from being in the same division, but they're both coming off wins over Green Bay. So they're definitely both riding high. The Colts are coming off the bye week, and the Titans are just playing pretty hot. Marcus Mariota has been pretty solid over the past couple weeks, so I think going into this game, he's going to be riding high and going up against a less than Colts team. he could have a pretty solid day. So I really like Marcus Mariota this week. I think he's a top 10 quarterback at least. DeMarco Murray, he didn't have a huge game last week, but I think you still got to start him because he's been producing like a number one running back this year again. The wide receivers for the Titans, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I think Rashard Matthews, he's good enough to be a flex play right now because he's been getting a ton of targets, and he's been outside of Delaney Walker. I think Marcus Mariota is going to go to Rashard Matthews next. And I think Tajaé Sharpe has still been a little bit relevant, but he hasn't done enough to really start him fantasy-wise. So I would keep him on the bench. But I think Rashard Matthews really deserves consideration to be in people's flex this week. And then Delaney Walker, he is one of the top 10 tight ends, so you're starting him regardless. On the Colts side of the ball, Andrew Luck, you got to hope that he's going to turn it around. I really think it's the halfway through the season, and I said this in my King's Decrees that Andrew Luck is going to have a slow start to the season, and then when it really gets to the point where the playoff race starts, Andrew Luck will start kicking it up a notch. So I think Andrew Luck has a good game. I think this could be a high-scoring game. So I like a lot of these guys on both of these teams. Frank Gore, even though he is super old and it just seems like he's got nothing left in the tank, he keeps continuing to produce. He's in the top 15 in rushing this year. He's coming off of a 2-touchdown game. I don't think you're going to get another 2-touchdown game out of him, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he can at least get one. Anybody can fall into the end zone. Andrew Luck's favorite wide receiver, T.Y. Hilton, you pretty much have to start him every week because if you don't, then he's going to go off for 10 catches and 200 yards. So you're starting T.Y. Hilton. But the guy that I like beside him is Dante Moncrief. He's been getting, he came back from injury, and he's from the 2 games that he's been back, he has a touchdown in both games. So there's definitely the connection between Andrew Luck. So I think he's a decent sleeper this week, and he should really be in flex considerations for a lot of teams. Next matchup I have the Arizona Cardinals taking on the Minnesota Vikings. And the Cardinals, they've dropped off. Outside of David Johnson, who, I freely admit that I was completely wrong about him, that David Johnson is one of the best running backs in the league. But outside of him, the Cardinals have definitely been disappointing this year. And people just expected a lot more out of them, seeing what we saw last year. So Carson Palmer going up against a Vikings defense, even though the Vikings seem to be in free fall, they've lost their last couple games in a row after their hot start. So I don't like Carson Palmer. I think he could have a rough day, and I think that spells that's not good for the other wide receivers and tight ends on this team. David Johnson, I still think he's going to be fine. I think you may see less production out of him this week just because he's going up against a pretty solid defense. But David Johnson, you're still going to start him, and he's still going to be a productive player for you fantasy-wise. And then at the wide receiver position, the only guy that I really think has value this week is Larry Fitzgerald. He's the guy who, when you're going up against a good defense, Carson Palmer is probably going to key in on Larry Fitzgerald. I don't like J.J. Nelson, don't like John Brown, don't like Michael Floyd enough to really start them in fantasy. And it's a lot of the same on the other side of the ball with the Minnesota Vikings. Sam Bradford definitely going up against the Cardinals. I don't think he's a very good start. He's not a good start any week, really. And then the running back situation with Matt Asiata, Jerick McKinnon, Ronnie Hillman, there's just too many people there to really have any solidification there. So I don't like to start any of those guys. If I had to pick one and put him in flex, I'd go with Matt Asiata, just because I think he's the guy who I think has the best chance to get a touchdown. And then at wide receiver, Stephon Diggs, he's really shown, kind of like on the Browns, that he's with Terrell Pryor, that he's the only guy that's doing anything really on the team. Stephon Diggs is really the only wide receiver on the Vikings right now who's going to produce fantasy-wise for you. So you start him, Adam Thielen, Laquan Treadwell, Cordero Patterson. have him in the back of your mind. Have him on your radar. I'm not even saying have these guys on your team, but they're definitely out there, and they're not going to be startable this week. Next matchup I got for you, I have the Miami Dolphins going out to LA to take on the Rams. And I really only have this game on my list because of the Rams, because they finally are starting the first overall pick in this year's draft, Jared Goff, over Case Keenum, which I'm not thinking that he's going to do a ton, and he definitely has a tough matchup against a red-hot Dolphins team. But it's, I think especially for Todd Gurley owners, you have to hope that Jared Goff can come in and provide some sort of air attack, because that's the main reason that Todd Gurley hasn't been able to do anything this year, is because Case Keenum isn't a threat. You can load 8 guys in the box and then just cover the rest of their wide receivers. Their wide receivers aren't good enough to get open by themselves. They're a bunch of small receivers. So you hope Jared Goff comes in and provides something. And I don't think fantasy-wise, at least yet, you can't start him. But I think this might help out Todd Gurley, because even if Goff doesn't do good this week, I think the Dolphins are at least going to have to respect, and because they're not sure what they're going to see from Jared Goff. So Gurley could actually have a decent game this week. Tavon Austin, Kenny Britt, I think they come into flex conversations, but I really don't want to start those guys. On the other side of the ball with the Miami Dolphins, Ryan Tannehill, definitely not a starter fantasy-wise. And then Jay Ajayi could have a decent game, but going up against an LA Rams and a tough defensive front, he could have a less than day. And then there's the wide receivers. Tannehill, even though he's been okay the past couple weeks, not really good fantasy-wise, he spreads the ball around a lot. So, it's going to Jarvis Landry, to Devontae Parker, and Kenny Stills, and it's not really providing one really good fantasy player. It's spreading the ball around to 3 guys and killing fantasy teams. So the only guy that I'd really feel comfortable starting would be Jarvis Landry. Devontae Parker, maybe. Kenny Stills, he's really good for a long touchdown, and that's what we saw last week from him. But the Dolphins are the Dolphins. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, I'll wrap up the rest of the matchups this week, and you're listening to The Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more, and follow them on Twitter at FanUpNetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerds. Let's wrap up the rest of these Week 11 matchups. Next, I got the New England Patriots going to the Bay Area to take on the San Francisco 49ers. And really, there's only one team that matters in this matchup, and that's the New England Patriots. Tom Brady, I think he's going to want to come back from his less-than performance against the Seahawks last week, and I think he's really going to pound the 49ers this week. So Tom Brady is always a must-start, but I think he's going to have a big week this week. The running back situation, you saw last week, LeGarrette Blount get 3 touchdowns. I think that is the outlier. You're not going to get 3 touchdowns every week from LeGarrette Blount. And especially also with Dion Lewis maybe making a comeback this week. And that's unsure. He was healthy last week, but he was a healthy scratch. He was still left inactive. So you now have LeGarrette Blount, James White, and Dion Lewis now coming off of an injury. Dion Lewis definitely not ready to take on a full load of work, so I'm not starting Dion Lewis. James White, I think he may fall by the wayside because LeGarrette Blount is still going to get his touches. If they get down to the goal line, they're still going to go to LeGarrette Blount in those goal-to-go situations. But in passing situations, that's where you're going to see Dion Lewis get eased into this offense. So it's going to hurt James White's performance. So I don't think either of those guys you can really rely on this week to start. And then at the wide receiver, it's really a toss-up. Julian Edelman, Danny Amendola, you're not sure who's going to get a touchdown. The only guy who you really are sure is probably going to get a touchdown every week would be Rob Gronkowski. So I think you start Rob Gronkowski. I think Julian Edelman, he's at best a flex, but I would leave alone the rest of those Patriot wide receivers. On the opposite side with the 49ers, Colin Kaepernick, he's not a starter, and definitely not against this Patriots offense. The only guy who I would really consider starting on this 49er team, if he's going to play, if he's healthy, would be Carlos Hyde. And even then, the Patriots are so good at game planning for teams. So if they see that Carlos Hyde is playing, even if he has a decent first half, that Bill Belichick is going to go into the half, and he's going to game plan, and he'll be able to shut down Carlos Hyde. So if Hyde does play and you're going to have to watch, I would definitely expect less of him going up against a really good New England Patriots team who is going to want revenge for the loss last week. Next matchup I have the Seattle Seahawks inviting in the Philadelphia Eagles, two of the better teams in the NFC this year. The Eagles, Carson Wentz, he's not looking that good. I mean, he's a rookie. I get it. And I really didn't believe that he was actually going to play at all this year. But so he had the really good start to the season, but I think people have tape on him now. They know what he does. He's not really a mobile quarterback. He has the ability to run, but when he's in the pocket, he doesn't have the pocket presence yet of a seasoned veteran. So that really hurts him. So Carson Wentz, especially going up against the Seahawks, is not a start this week. Ryan Matthews, you saw last week, he had a pair of touchdowns. He pretty much came out of nowhere, pissed me off because I had him on my bench on my team. So Ryan Matthews, I think he's only a borderline start this week, just because you never know if the Eagles somehow get down to the goal line, they might be able to punch it in. But the Seahawks have a tremendous defense, so I think all the Eagles are going to suffer this week. Darren Sproles, his only value at this point is in PPR. I think earlier in the season it looked like he was really finding the fountain of youth, but it's really shown now. He's a PPR back. If you have him in a standard league, I don't know why you have him on your team. There's probably somebody else out there who's better than him, or you could get some value from him in a trade. So Darren Sproles, only start him in PPR situations, and then the only wide receiver you're starting on the Eagles would be Jordan Matthews. And again, going up against the Seahawks, if you have a better situation, maybe you have a Jamison Crowder on your bench. I'd start Jamison Crowder definitely over Jordan Matthews this week. Even with guys in front of Jamison Crowder, he's a better situation. On the other side of the ball with the Seattle Seahawks, Russell Wilson last week had one of those games where it's like, oh yeah, that's why he was rated as the third best quarterback this year. He had like 350 yards and 3 touchdowns, and I think part of that was the team that they were playing. They had to throw a bunch to stay in the game, and they just didn't have the running game to kind of dictate the game the way that they would want it to. So maybe this is the beginning. We saw it last year where Russell Wilson went on a tear at the end of the season and just put up a ton of yards, a ton of touchdowns. So maybe this is the beginning again. So if they do continue to throw a lot, Russell Wilson could continue to have some pretty decent games. And I think he has a good matchup against the Eagles at home. The running back situation, which was probably one of the most biggest surprises of the week, Christian Michael had been the starting running back for weeks when Thomas Rawls was injured. And Christian Michael, he did pretty okay. I mean, he wasn't great, but he wasn't horrible. And they released him at the beginning of the week, which it kind of blew my mind a little bit, but I think it says a lot about the guy that they have coming in. And that's the rookie running back who I love. And I told you about him all the way back at the beginning of the season, CJ Prosise. He's a dual threat. He is the pass catcher, and I think he has the ability to run the ball. So CJ Prosise, you saw him last week. He didn't do a ton on the ground, but he made up with the passing game. So, and also with Thomas Rawls coming back this week, I think they're going to ease Rawls in, and I think you're still going to see CJ Prosise get the bulk of the carries this week. So I think he's actually a starter. I would put him at a high-end running back 2 and a low-end running back 1. So I would start CJ Prosise this week. I'd still leave Thomas Rawls on your bench. And then the wide receiver, Doug Baldwin, he finally showed up in the last game. Again, when guys have multiple touchdown games, it's going to be the outlier. Unless this is really the beginning of last year where Baldwin just went on a tear with Russell Wilson, Baldwin is still going to be a good start. So I think he kind of moved from being a fringe flex player to definitely being a wide receiver start every week. And then the other wide receivers on the team, Tyler Lockett and Jermaine Kearse, they're not good enough to really be fantasy starters just yet. But if you're going into your fantasy playoffs, those are two guys that you're gonna wanna know about and possibly pick them up to have on your team. Because if Russell Wilson does start to just throw a ton, you saw last week that Baldwin got the touchdowns, but Lockett and Kearse both got a ton of targets and they got some yards, and the touchdowns may just come to them. So not starting them this week, but I think they definitely should be on your radar, and you might want to pick them up. Next matchup I have the Green Bay Packers going to the Washington Redskins. The Packers, the other team in the NFC North, who's on a free fall, along with the Minnesota Vikings. They're coming off of losses to the huge loss to the Titans and a loss to the Colts the week before that. Aaron Rodgers just doesn't seem to look right, and there's been talk of feuding between Aaron Rodgers and the coach and the staff and Aaron Rodgers and the team, and that's not good for any football team. So Aaron Rodgers, I hate to say it because I have him on one of my team, and it's a really tough situation to bench Aaron Rodgers. You know, he's going up against an okay Redskins team, so I would probably likely still start Aaron Rodgers unless you have a really good option to start over him. Maybe you have a Matt Stafford. I'd start Stafford definitely over to Rodgers at this point. Matt Ryan is on a bye week, obviously, but I would start him over Aaron Rodgers at this point. But I definitely have a bad feeling about Aaron Rodgers again this week. And then the running back situation, we just talked about. Christian Michael got released by the Seahawks. The Packers went out and picked him up. So anybody who I wouldn't expect too much out of him this week, because you saw when they went out and they traded for Nal Davis earlier in the season, he came in week 1, did nothing, and he just didn't really do anything. I'm not sure. I think Christian Michael will do, because he's a better running back than Nal Davis. Christian Michael will be more involved in the offense. I'm just not sure you can depend on him this week to really pick up this offense. I think you're still going to see James Starks. He's probably still questionable, but James Stark will get the bulk of the carries this week. And, I mean, the one guy on the Packers I still feel comfortable starting every week is Jordy Nelson, because he gets the bulk of those targets, and he's still a really good wide receiver. Randall Cobb, Devontae Adams, Ty Montgomery, oh, man, those guys just live to let people down. The other week it was Devontae Adams, and Ty Montgomery and Randall Cobb did absolutely nothing. So I don't feel comfortable starting any of those guys. But if you have to, I completely understand. On the other side of the ball with the Washington Redskins, Kirk Cousins, we saw Andrew Luck, we saw Marcus Mariota take out the Green Bay Packers. This could be Kirk Cousins' week, and he could really solidify the Redskins being better this season by having a big game here. So I like Kirk Cousins. I'd probably put him right on the verge of the top 10 this week. The running back situation last week, Robert Kelly got the start, and Matt Jones was kind of a healthy scratch. I think you're going to have to watch again to see if Matt Jones maybe gets in this game, if he's active. But if not, Robert Kelly has kind of turned into an okay running back. He's kind of like Jordan Howard from the Chicago Bears, where he's not like the best running back in the world, but he's going to get you some decent points. So I think he has possibility as a running back too this week. And then at wide receiver, I think Pierre Garçon and Jameson Crowder, both. I've talked a lot about Jameson Crowder being probably the best target for Kirk Cousins this year, but Pierre Garçon had a ton of looks last week, especially with no Deshaun Jackson. So if there's no Deshaun Jackson again this week, I think Garcon and Crowder both are really decent flex plays, especially going up against the Packers. Now, if Deshaun Jackson does play, I'd say that hurts Pierre Garcon's value a little bit more. But Deshaun Jackson, if you have him and he plays, it's a really good matchup. I think he could have a big day. Especially, if I think Kirk Cousins is going to have a big day and Deshaun Jackson is playing, he's going to be a part of that. So I like Deshaun Jackson this week if he plays, but you're going to have to watch that. And then Jordan Reed will definitely be part of this offense. He may even be the biggest benefactor going up against the Packers. Last matchup of the week I got for you is the Houston Texans taking on the Oakland Raiders on Monday Night Football. The Texans, they messed up, and they got to admit it. Brock Osweiler, they gave him a ton of money, and he just doesn't look good. They won last week, and their record doesn't show it. But Osweiler is not that good. He had 2 touchdowns on 99 yards last week. And either of those touchdowns went to none of the big name players. They went to 2 no-name tight ends. So Brock Osweiler, especially going up against the Oakland Raiders, I don't like him this week. Lamar Miller, he's still good enough to be a starting running back, but they're just running him into the ground. I feel like they just, because teams know that Osweiler is going to struggle, they're definitely loading up in the box. So Lamar Miller is still going to get you points. I think you lower him down almost to a running back 2 at this point. DeAndre Hopkins is really the only serviceable wide receiver at this point, but if you have better options, I might start somebody over DeAndre Hopkins this week, just because he's not getting those touchdowns. Brock Osweiler can't get him the ball. He throws it to him a ton, but usually it's overthrown or it's just bad throws. Osweiler isn't delivering the ball to DeAndre Hopkins the way he did, or he got the ball last year. So DeAndre Hopkins, I'd still start him, but again, it's scary how bad some of these wide receivers are doing this year because they don't have good quarterbacks. And you might say, oh, those 2 tight ends who caught touchdowns, what about them? Maybe we should start them? Don't start those guys. Those guys are no-name players, and more than likely they're not going to catch another tight end this year. And really, they caught touchdowns, but the rest of their stat line, it did nothing for you. If you combined their total stats last week, you would have 4 catches for 14 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, the 2 touchdowns are nice, and if you are in a league where touchdowns count for a lot more, that might be okay. It's serviceable, but it's still not a great day. If you're in a league where you only get maybe 3 points for a touchdown, that's an awful day, even with 2 touchdowns. So I'm not starting either of those guys. On the opposite side of the ball with the Oakland Raiders have been one of the stories of the NFL this year. Derek Carr, he's finally stepping up, being a franchise quarterback. I think he could have a big game in the spotlight on Monday Night Football. I like him this week. Latavius Murray, if he's fully healthy, I really like him, and you can't discount him in what he can do. And I think that Texans defense isn't that great. So I like Latavius Murray, and then I like both of those wide receivers on the Raiders. Amari Cooper is going to be the number 1 guy. He's going to get the bulk of the targets, but Michael Crabtree, you can't discount him. He's always going to be a red zone threat for this team. That wraps up the matchups, and that about wraps up this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. Good luck to you all in Week 11, and until next time, later, nerds.